Hello, and thank you all for joining us on the Hub, the AQR series of regular webinars. There's around about 100 of you listening in, and that's a tribute to how well these sessions are being received these days. I'm Ken Parker, the chair of the AQR, and I'm delighted to welcome a former chair and good friend, Rosie Campbell. In my opinion, Rosie is the queen of qualitative analysis, and let's face it, analysis is the key activity that qualies need to respect. Otherwise, we lose our point of differentiation from anyone who picks up a tape recorder and says they're a quali. The webinar would take around 20 to 30 minutes, and we'd welcome questions. Just submit your thoughts by typing them in, and Rosie will either answer them at the end or via a personal email. So, over to Rosie, who will talk to you about language analysis, the qualitative Holy Grail.
Hi everybody, and thanks very much, Ken, especially for that fantastic billing. I'm extremely flattered to be called the Queen of anything. No pressure there then, and I know there's a lot of you listening, so I'm very excited particularly to be talking about something which is quite a sort of a favourite topic of mine, and that's analysis, but in particular language analysis. I'm hoping that I'm going to show you throughout the next 20-30 minutes how I see language analysis as being the absolute sort of holy grail where qualitative analysis is concerned. Just a quick thing about this particular webinar. I mean, I often wander around and do things like cook while I'm listening to a webinar. If you're that sort of person, you can do it for nearly all of this, but when I will alert you if there's a slide that I think it would be particularly useful for you to be staring at while I'm talking about it. One of the things about doing a webinar on the subject of language is it's quite anxiety provoking, because one of my views about language is that it's very much something created in concert with other people. It's a kind of communicative activity, and I realise that what scares me about webinars and doing anything where I'm talking to a blank wall, although Ken is here reassuringly, is the feeling that I'm not getting any feedback at all. So hopefully you are reacting in some ways, and of course the way one structures these things usually is by having some kind of cognizance and observation of body language. Well, I can't get any of that, so it's going to be me talking about language, hopefully in ways that you can follow and that inspire you. If even a handful of you think more about the language that you encounter in your research sessions at the end of it and use it more in your analysis, I shall be extremely happy. Okay, let's have a little think. What is good analysis? And I think one of the things I want to talk about in this is really how you can end up kind of offering your clients champagne rather than the local house wine from the pub down the road at the end of your research. And I think, you know, as Ken was hinting there, and we've talked about this together, I know that I think it's just going to become more and more and more important, that it has to become the thing that as qualitative researchers we focus on more and more, because you know what, we can't beat technology at accessing data, we can't beat technology at generating data, but we can beat technology at making new meanings out of the data that we access, and that of course is the function of analysis. So I think it's going to become much more important in future decades. So let's talk a little bit about what good analysis is and what it isn't. And I thought kind of a nice starting point for this would be to mention to you, I think some of you may have heard previous webinars, but if we think about the sort of, if you like, the theories and the philosophies that are kicking around at the moment, you would expect me to mention behavioral economics. And from the standpoint of analysis, that's quite an interesting one. And I think Nick Attenborough's recent webinar for this series was particularly enlightening about that. Perhaps I'm being a Philistine to summarize it in this way, but broadly speaking, he made the very important point, and one that's been recognized by behavioral scientists quite a bit recently, that actually there is a possibility that our search for ever deeper is somewhat redundant, because we reveal much of our thinking, our views, our emotions within pretty much the first few seconds of how we're about to respond to something. So in a sense, he was sort of suggesting, oh, Nick Southgate. Why did I say Nick Attenborough? That was a weird one. How bizarre. I think I do know somebody called Nick Attenborough, which is really interesting because I'm going to talk about Freudian slips in a moment. Yeah, thanks, Ken. Okay, just kick me if it happens again. So he made the point, Nick Southgate, I do apologise, Nick, I hope you're not listening. Anyway, that we really need to become experts at looking for the very first response in qualitative analysis. And you know what? I would agree with that. And I'm going to talk to you about how I think observing, understanding and attending to language can provide that for us, as well as perhaps going deeper. Mark Earls, who also did a webinar in this series, I have got his name right, I think, and again, rather condensing his thinking, but some of his views are, well, we don't need to reanalyze everything because actually, do you know what? We are, as a species, extremely good at copying. We're very good at learning from each other. And maybe the most kind of important things we need to be discovering for our clients is what kind of thing we're dealing with, what nature of a problem this market tends to suggest we're looking at. And therefore, we can simply borrow from the vocabulary of others who've looked at similar problems and so on. And indeed, that copying thing is very interesting. And I would also suggest that we can use the thought that we are keen copiers and essentially lazy in our thinking, i.e. inclined to repeat what we've just heard, and we can use that to analyze language as well. And he also said, which I think was very important, that you become very, very, very experienced at just getting the right sort of instinctive feelings about material when you're a qualitative researcher. And in fact, he very specifically singled out Kevin McLean, if I remember rightly, but I think there may be a number of us that can do this, and that we do have a wonderful body of experience of just hearing a lot of language a lot of times, and we should not ignore our own internal sentiments, our own feelings about what's happening when we listen to material. The last person I want to mention before I, if you like, draw them all together and suggest why I think looking at language can bring together all the theories, is Roy, who actually, it was rather encouraging that he went back to some, if you like, some more traditional classical qualitative research thinking when he talked about methodologies, and was suggesting that people are not simplistic and animalistic, and it's not just first response, but they can indeed be encouraged or coached, he I think used the word trained, to access a deeper perception of their own understanding. So in a sense, you can train people in their own self-awareness so that the kind of stuff you get from research is essentially at a deeper level, so they kind of can understand better what their deeper level feelings and thoughts and how they make decisions can be sort of revealed in those ways. He did feel that you need sort of time and a very kind of non-rejecting sort of kind of cooperative environment in which to do that, and these are not always things that we get in research these days. So he leans, if you like, to the sort of psychotherapeutic traditions of understanding what's happening when we analyze research data. So I'm going to suggest to you that looking at language can kind of have something to say about all those pockets of theory about how we do research as qualitative researchers. Before I talk about the language that emerges in data, let's just think about how we are traditionally taught to deal with analysis. And I think probably an awful lot of time is spent talking about styles of research these days, methodologies, approaches, numbers and access points, and probably not enough is spent talking about just what you do with this mass of stuff. And in fact, it can be really overwhelming in some situations now, because with online qual, you may well have a huge amount of data, just much, much, much more than we would have ever had in the traditional, even 12-group project from the old COI, when it used to not really consider anything worth doing unless it was more than about 10 groups. Anyway, so we're traditionally taught that we should do several things. We should definitely revisit our material. We should probably count things. We should just take a look at how many people are doing certain things. We should definitely categorize things. We should develop themes. We should amass pockets of findings. We might re-describe things, and then we might weight them because we know what the objectives of the client are in conducting this piece of research. So we might say, well, there's a lot on that, but do you know what, it doesn't matter to them. So we're going to do all of those kinds of things with our material. But do you know what? I'm not decrying doing any of those tasks, and they're great things to do, but it's a little bit like tidying the sock drawer, because all of those activities will give you another pile of data, or possibly several piles of data, but it probably won't tell anyone what socks mean to the wearer. So we've got all this massive data, and what I'm going to suggest to you is that actually what we're all dealing with, the clay, if you like, of our material is simply language. And I think there's more to a lot of the language that we receive in research than you might at first sight think. I was very, very disheartened this morning when I got one of those things in my inboxes, and it simply said, it was from some commercial company. I hope whoever it is isn't listening. I don't think they will be. But it was words to the effect, here are the 10 most important things you should do when you're analysing online qualitative data. I clicked on it immediately because I thought, I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. I'd better just see what this chap or woman says. And there were 10 things, and I glazed by about the 6th, and not a single one of them mentioned anything about language, which I thought was pretty dreadful, frankly. So anyway, let's make the assumption that you have generated a wonderful body of data through conducting your research, whether you've done interviews, or you've done groups, or you've even done an online project. Sorry, I'm losing my earphones here. I think they were set to fit Ken. It's all right. Okay, so you've got all this wonderful data, and let's also assume, and again I think the 3 people I mentioned earlier had some good things to say about this, that you've generated it using some wonderful kind of open-ended questions, some circular questioning. You know, you've done it in the right kind of ways so that the stuff you've got, the material you've got, the language you've got should be wonderfully rich. And I'm going to talk about how we might lean on language. What have the academics had to say about language? And let's just have a quick think about this. And I suspect if you are an academic listening, you're going to find it a bit of a sort of Philistine, I've compressed rather probably a century's history of thinking about language. And I've picked out 4 people that I personally think have something useful to say about language, particularly in our world, if you like. If there's one thing in common between Freud, Wittgenstein, Foucault, Chomsky and Pinker, in fact there are several things in common, they're all, broadly speaking, you could call them postmodern, in that they don't see things as so absolute as some of the modernists did. Anyway, if there's one thing in common in terms of how they think about language, it's that it's to a degree fateful. In other words, that we in part select our words with a view to doing a job with them which is more than simply conveying the simplistic message. So it's not just a matter of transmission. They also probably would all agree that our emotions load our words very significantly. So let me just give you a little kind of example of that. You can read the words on the screen, or you can wander around as I talk to you here. So to the simple question, do you want anything for lunch? We might get one answer, which is, yes, tuna mayo on brown, low-fat spread, please. We might get another answer, oh, I feel so guilty about you going again. Oh, should I go? Oh, but if you are going, anything quick and easy, tuna mayo or something. Now, they are effectively the same answer, but in hearing them, you will appreciate that actually they say something incredibly different. So there is a function behind those words which is different to and beyond the words that are being used. And of course our primitive brains, which is the bit that people refer to as System 1 these days, just won't let go of our mouths. So let's have a think about how we might be very particular in how we choose words. There's a thing known as the sort of proximity or distance effect. So in describing yourself, you're much more likely to be kind in your description once you describe somebody who's very much somebody you don't know or the third person, you might be less kind. So, for example, the description "I am slim, you are thin, he is scrawny" might be three ways of saying the same thing, but with different subjects. I noticed on a flight back from Rhodes recently, and I don't know if British Airways have done this as a policy, that they actually said, and I found it very comforting because I'm quite a scared flyer. First of all, they said, we're about to start our journey, when we were going to take off, but then more importantly, and the bit I really hate is landing, by the way, they actually said, cabin crew to your seats now, 5 minutes to arrival. And I noticed how much better that made me feel. So the way we pick our descriptive words has a fantastic import on the listener. Are you always listening for those things in research? And the choice of metaphor or simile that you will hear in people's descriptions, again, can be very telling and very important. There's always, in everything we say, quite a considerable emotional load. If you think about hearing somebody go, he's not exactly what you'd call fat, but... So what you hear when that happens is the word fat. And actually the impression you're left with is that that person is indeed fat, despite the comment denying it. Now again, on the surface, you could easily say, oh, well, that was somebody describing somebody who wasn't fat. But somehow, what you've heard is a description of somebody who is being described as fat. So again, it's how we load our language that can be quite significant. And I think a lot of this comes from the way we learn to speak in the very first place. My 1-year-old granddaughter can't really say dog yet, but she sees a dog and her body starts to move, so we get a lot of body language, and she goes woof, woof. So she understands there's a metaphor for dog and it's woof. And the other thing, have I got time to do this, Ken? I'm going to do it anyway because I think it's really important. I was going to read you some poetry just to remind you, and again, you don't need to look at the screen for this, you can wander around your office or your kitchen, wherever you are. I just think I always read poetry when I do this stuff on language because people forget how powerfully and emotionally we use language in lots and lots of contexts, not just in a group discussion. You may know this one, but I love it because it's a great example of where individual words are so rich and deep as well as the metaphors. It's by William Butler Yeats. Had I the heavens embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. And I really do challenge anybody not to feel just slightly moved, even if I didn't read it in the best possible way. I think it's really appropriate because it's the 100-year anniversary of Dylan Thomas. I think it's this week, isn't it? The last bit that I think it's worth just mentioning, and of course Freud was very big on this, that, you know, sometimes how we leak in our language is also quite important and quite telling. How often have you seen respondents answering a question with their bodies before they say anything? And somehow when the words come out, even if they're a bit hiccupy, you know that actually the first answer you got was the important one. Of course, when your brain is very, very strongly driven by emotions, for example, sexual encounters are the classic one, you may find that the words that come out actually slip in a direction that you didn't intend them to. I sort of ran into a friend. I'd be careful I don't make a slip myself here. I ran into a friend at a tennis club recently, and I was surprised to see him there, and I knew he'd been having a hit on a court with another friend who he is extremely keen on. Let's call him Tom. I said, "Oh, Tom, what are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I've just been knocking Annie up." Oh, and then, to make matters worse, he corrected himself. "I mean warming her up." At which point he realized that he just had to stop. But there are many people, and obviously Freud was significant here, who believe that some of the way that language slips out from under us is more telling than perhaps we intended it to be. So all of those things may be significant, and are you listening for them, and are you noticing them in your online forums? Are you reading them in the words? So if you don't already, I would simply charge you with becoming a lot smarter and a lot more careful at how you listen to language and how you notice language. And I know Roy said a wonderful thing in his webinar. He said, which I really liked, was to get better at understanding how we can train respondents to become experts at understanding their own views. That's not too complicated. You had to watch more reality TV, because he suggested that that was exactly a situation in which people are trained up to do something well, which they've previously done rather badly. Not quite sure how that applies to Big Brother, but hey. So my equivalent of that is eavesdropping. And I love eavesdropping, and I'm a very curious person, and I suppose it's why I've enjoyed being a qualitative researcher over the years, or it may be the other way around. I find that being an eavesdropper and using my curiosity feeds my ability and skill and interest in qual. So, hey, the two feed each other. And again, I think you'll find, you know, you might say, oh my God, I don't know anything about the sort of study of psycholinguistics, but do you know what? You're probably a lot better than you think. Just take this as a little exercise, a little example. I'll read it to you, although again this might be a moment you would look at the screen if you wanted to. So this is overheard, mother and son walking down the street. Son is kind of like about 22. Some of you may relate to the son, some to the mother in this. The mother says, so did you find time to bring that job agency yesterday? Son, no, I've said I will. Mother, that's a shame. Laura said they're really helpful to Ben. He's got a job now. Maybe try them sometime? Son, I've said I will. Have you got their number on your phone? Says the mother. I've said I will, Mum. So we've overheard that little snippet of conversation. I'm just suggesting that you might look at some of the way language is operating there. She comes in full of pleasantries and giving him the benefit of the doubt, suggesting that he might or might not have had the time to ring the job agency. We know what the real text of this is. She really is putting pressure on him to get on with it and get himself a job. He feels severely nagged and is trying to get her off his back. And he is just blocking her out by saying nothing in his replies. We've probably also had respondents, all of us, like this, where you're just kind of getting those three-liners. And obviously the learning is you need to change the way you're asking questions. She then uses bigger guns. She thinks, well, I'll bring in somebody he might know and use that as a support case. And then, because none of that's worked, she comes in with, have you got their number on your phone? Because she's actually going to virtually make this call for him clearly. Here's another example. And actually, I almost took this down verbatim from a holiday I was on. So it's a man and a woman sitting with some children, and the man says it's at breakfast time in a hotel. So if you take the kids first thing, I'll swap over about 11, yeah? The woman goes, I did do breakfast this morning, you know. Man, I'm not saying you didn't, but it is my holiday too, though. The woman says, but you said how a holiday was basically about spending more time with Ali and Jake. I have changed their names, but they were quite like that. So what's going on there? Again, you're probably all absolutely clever enough to work out that the words don't necessarily tell the whole story, but just to look at a couple of interesting things there. The man, to begin with, uses the word kids, and the woman uses the phrase do breakfast. So it's a very, very neutral sort of verb. It doesn't seem to involve anything kind of sophisticated, skillful or emotional. Ditto the word kids, it kind of abstracts them and makes light of them. By the end of that tiny exchange, they have names, and we're almost getting into the philosophy of parenting, because we're talking, the woman is using the emotional blackmail of how he said he wanted to spend more time with the kids on holiday. So in those tiny snippets of language, how much extra is revealed by choice of verbs, choice of using names and not names, what the verb was to describe the activity of looking after the children over breakfast. It went from do breakfast to spending more time with Ali and Jake. So it's not impossible that you can notice this stuff all the time in research contexts and really get much more significant levels of meaning. I'll be quite quick through the last couple because these are a couple of examples which I think are particularly useful in research context. There are two areas that I think it really pays to study the language, and you can do it in the moment. And the more tuned in you get to listening to language, the more you start to pick it up as you hear it, literally during the group, during the interview, as you're interacting with somebody. Okay. The two things are the kind of cultural discourses that are operating in an area of a market that you're charged to work in, or if you're a client, in which you work all the time. And the other is about the stories that people typically tell about their belief systems. Again, they can be very, very important to the mass of your findings. And I'll give you a couple of little hints about how you spot when something is being said about each of those contexts. The cultural discourses that run around an area are not stationary. They kind of move with the time. So the sort of cultural discourse around, say, drinking in the 1970s was different to what it is now. So it was all about kind of worries about kids and alcopops and so on. I'm just highlighting the fact that, you can't just go and search for these and you know it about your market. The way you notice when somebody's talking in a way that suggests it's a kind of important discourse for that market area is, the first one is cliches. Whenever you hear somebody sort of pontificating in one of those kind of cliched fashions, then you might suspect that they're talking about something which is it's a kind of powerful known about that market area. So that's just an example. The Facebook generation are basically the fashion police, and I think that was in the context of it was about fashion actually, the project, but it was older people saying that younger people don't like them sort of wearing the same kind of clothes that they wear. So there was this assumption that somehow the young have a right and feel they know it all where fashion's concerned, and was using that kind of cliche, sort of the cliche being the fashion police and the Facebook generation. So two sort of, you don't have to think very hard to come out with those. So you kind of assume that your audience will know the sort of seedbed of that cliche. And then there's those kind of assumed truths that again you hear, they're often said in the third person or even as a kind of it is known or one does. They don't often start with the word I. So they're things like, you're nobody till you're on the property ladder. We've all had enough of the fat cat culture. And again, they're often thrown out in research context, meaning this is a scene setter. We all do believe in this, don't we? And maybe sometimes you want to challenge into that. But it's important that you notice them because you won't know anything about the market area or how you're going to have people react to the packaging or whatever if you don't know what those basic cultural truths are that are running through the sort of seam. Being rich won't make you happy. And where people are telling stories about themselves, the thing that I always suggest people look out for are descriptions and phrases where they kind of generalize about the type of person they are. And they're often family beliefs. So you might get something like, oh, we've always been savers in our family. And that's almost like somebody putting up a kind of flag saying, don't you start tempting me with ideas about loans or doing something else, because do you know what? My instincts are all about saving. In our house, we don't trust online security. Again, it's a sort of, this is one of the rules we run our lives by. So it's really important to listen out for those. And the way those things are said is often the telltale. And self-beliefs. I only have to look at a cake and I put on weight. Again, lovely use of metaphor. And I'm rubbish at saving. So I often use examples from the money and the weight market, partly because I've worked in both of them a lot. Well, entirely, really. So I don't know if I've got time to do these. Shall I whiz through them, Ken? Yep. Okay, right. Some examples, very specific examples, because I think it's important to be really practical in these kind of contexts. This isn't a philosophy about a sort of academic philosophy. I really think that really listening and really noticing language really helps you do good research and create an analysis which is very useful and is a bit more like champagne than house white. So, some years ago we did a large project for, actually I think they were then Norwich Union, but they've since become Aviva. And it was very profoundly important to listen to how people talked about their financial lives, because at the time Norwich Union stranded their service delivery by product type. So if you were in annuities, you worked in the annuities department, it was kind of all siloed up. I'm sure everything's changed now. And actually our work in part led to the completely reconfiguring of how they marketed. And it was, broadly speaking, slightly by Wealth Group, but it was very significantly focused on life stage, because what we noticed in people's language around the stories they were telling was that actually kind of where they were in their financial place was very strongly to do with the stage they were at in life, and that's how they thought about themselves. So it was no good talking to them about a specific product like this particular life insurance product, when actually what they wanted to know was that a financial services provider understood what their story was at that point in their lives, and particularly the nearing retirement and the new young family people kind of were very time capsule trapped. And it was very useful for Norwich Union to discover that and to start thinking, understanding how the language that we were hearing was the language of their consumers, and therefore they could speak back in the right language. So those are just some, I mean, they're fairly ordinary comments when you're just setting up and the kids come along. There's no spare, let's face it. I think your priorities are always in the family. So it was the language that kept bringing us back to where they were in their lives that was really important there. People feel safest in bricks and mortar, talking about the anxiety that people have just coming up to retirement. You need to be able to sleep at night when you're getting close to retiring. You need certainty that it will last. Don't we all agree? And again, I'm using weight here because I did a lot of work for Weight Watchers over about a decade. And I think one of the more interesting projects in terms of, or several projects it was actually, in terms of language and how useful it was the sort of, I mean, again, these are not, it doesn't seem like rocket science, but it became very apparent that Weight Watchers as a brand had the authority to talk to people as if they understood how their heads were working in relation to eating. It wasn't just a matter of you can have 2 portions of cabbage and 1.5 points worth of ice cream. The science and the nutrition was secondary to this kind of support line and the sort of good mum line that was needed from Weight Watchers around the aspects of weight loss to do with how people thought. And again, a lot of this was revealed in the language. And there was a very successful TV campaign a few years ago, you may even remember it, where a woman comes down the stairs in a red dress and she looks at herself in the mirror and she goes, after, I can't remember what the voiceover says, but she basically says, so it was in my head, not my tummy, and she pats the head and she pats the tummy, which I've just done actually, which didn't help you guys. But we helped them reach that understanding because we listened carefully to and we looked at the language that ordinary people were using. So I've just thrown you out a few that are the sort of telling comments that you would hear quite a lot in that situation. I'm a head case when it comes to crisps. We all comfort eat. I've got to psych myself, get into the right mind state to start losing. Everyone knows how to slim. It's all about belief and feeling ready. So lots and lots and lots of good hints that the language, the words chosen are all about a story to do with the mind, not the body. And that was really important to tell the client. Okay, so I've rattled through and I think I'm now at the end. I did throw out this little challenging slide. I'm not sure if I asked you to do this at the beginning, but of course I've been talking to you. You may or may not have been reading the words as well, but maybe there are things you've noticed about the way I've taught. I have deliberately embedded quite a few metaphors throughout this piece because that's very often a useful way of talking in a way that has a sort of teaching element. What have you heard in my language? Maybe some of it's been a bit lacking in clarity. I don't know. I'd be really interested in your observations because becoming good at analysing language is about hearing it and rehearing it. So I thank you for listening. Take care.
Thank you very much, Rosie. I think that's probably we will have questions being answered individually, and Rosie will get back to each of you that have submitted some. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you in particular to Rosie for what was absolutely fascinating. And now you can see why I call her the queen of qualitative analysis, and more so language analysis. So thank you very much, and thanks for giving up all your hard time and effort to get us to that. So, one final plug. I know there's quite a few listeners among you who aren't members of the AQR. Well, we'd like to change that. Please do consider joining. Go to the AQR website, click on Members Benefits, see what you're being offered, and once you've seen the fantastic array of stuff that we offer, I'm sure you'll go straight to the Let Me Join button. And you could join the other 900 or so qualitative researchers around the world who are in the AQR. Thank you very much indeed for coming, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. Oh, and by the way, this webinar will be on the AQR website in 2 weeks' time. Thank you. Goodbye.